Terentius's thoughts whirled for a moment as he stumbled in the dirt, the gravel in his boots rubbing his feet raw and adding to his torment. He'd been warned by his friends to wear socks to prevent chafing, but the Arabian heat was just too much to even think about such apparel. Righting himself, he gritted his teeth against the agony of his severed arm, momentarily dropping the groaning figure, gripping his elbow and raising the forearm to prevent too much blood flowing free. His tourniquet must have loosened. A quick glance over his shoulder told him it was just about over. Now it was all down to him. Taking a deep breath, he gathered a handful of the man's tunic in his fist and staggered on, hoping he had remained unnoticed. The catalogue of disasters that constituted Gallus's campaign had begun almost immediately. Rounding the tip of the Sinai, the fleet had encountered a freak storm at open sea and arrived battered and worn at the Arabian coast, only to discover that they would have to continue many leagues south along the rocky coast before finding a harbour where they could safely put in. Of the 130 ships that had slipped away from Arsinoe, fewer than 100 arrived at the port of Leuce, and as the men clambered wearily and distraught onto dry land, many had found somewhere quiet to make offerings, libations, or simple prayers to Neptune in fear or gratitude. Among the legions, resentment began to rise towards the prefect's Nabatean guide, Caelius, who had insisted on this disastrous route as the best entry point to the fabled lands of Arabia Felix. The Nabatean official had remained in the confidence of Prefect Gallus, however, insisting that there had been no reasonable alternative. What had been planned as a week-long sojourn at Leuce to allow time for any stray vessels to rejoin the fleet had then turned into months of waking nightmare as a sudden plague began to manifest itself among the men. An illness perhaps contracted at home and then spread in the cramped conditions of the ships, or possibly native to Leuce and virulent enough to move about the Roman camp like a sudden brush fire. The pessimists among the common soldiery, initially a minority that had now grown into the majority, proclaimed the campaign a mistake, doomed, and disfavoured by the gods. Truly, the size of Gallus's enormous force had almost halved by the time the disease had run its course, and the segregation of the sick from the healthy had halted its spread. The army that left Leuce the next spring, heading into the desert along ancient and mysterious nomadic trade routes, was a different force entirely to the one that had left Aegyptus. Brooding and dark, sick and tired, fewer than 7,000 men pressed on toward the fabled lands of Arabia Felix. The Nabatean Caelius once more leading the way, to the loathing of many. Terentius paused, his head spinning. The loss of blood was starting to affect him, and he was beginning to feel distinctly faint. Yet he had to press on, else all would be lost. Tearing off a strip of his russet-coloured tunic, he added an extra tourniquet, pulling it tight until the flow of blood slowed once more. Gritting his teeth, he glared down at the barely conscious man in the long brown robe and growled. Changing his grip, he grasped the man's long hair and used that to drag him across the rough ground. The next few months had been a blur of thirst, hunger, weakness, exhaustion, and despair, punctuated by occasional violent bloodshed when the army of Gallus came across a small town or settlement that confirmed they were in the lands of Arabia Felix and under the watchful gaze of the Sabaeans. The names of conquered towns went down in the prefect's wax tablets for later reports and to count toward the possibility of a triumph, though they meant little to the soldiers themselves. Neirani, Aska, Athrula. What constituted glorious expansion for Gallus meant the periodic loss of hundreds of comrades for his men. And then, finally, less than a week ago, they had reached the prefect's goal. The great mud brick, powerfully walled city